So good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And welcome. I'm glad to see so many people here. Very much appreciated. We're going to begin in about 1 minute. So if you want to just kind of settle into your tables, get whatever you need, and then we're going to be in the liturgy in about 1 minute. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We come together this morning to remember in a special way Father Bob Schreiter. We also hold in prayer our recently deceased mentor, professor, and president, Father Don Sr. Both men have been influential here at CTU and throughout the world. They have influenced our lives with their love, generosity, and goodness. As we celebrate the inauguration of the Schreiter Institute here at CTU, which is part of the Precious Blood Spirituality Institute, we know that they celebrate with us in heaven, as their spirits now shine brightly before their Lord and God. As we gather together in God's presence in this season of Advent, the Paschal candle reminds us of the resurrection. Just as God raised Christ Jesus from the dead, God's promise to each of us is resurrection. Resurrection is the source of our hope that God will make a way out of no way. God's Spirit flows abundantly, although sometimes imperceptibly, and binds us together as a community of hope, healing, and solidarity. So I invite one representative from each table to come forward, one table at a time, and you will bring the taper, the small thin candle from your table, light it from our Paschal candle, and return to your table to light the larger candle there. So once all candles are lit, we will begin with our prayers. So I invite you one at a time, one table at a time to come forward. God of mercies and Spirit of all consolation, you pursue us with an untiring love and dispel the shadow of death with the bright dawn of life. Grant that we, as we remember Father Bob and Father Don and all of our loved ones, we may hold their memories dear and live in hope of the eternal kingdom where you bring us together again. Your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, by dying has destroyed death, and by rising restored our life. Enable us, therefore, to press on toward him, so that, after our earthly course is run, he may reunite us with those we love, when every tear will be wiped away. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Please be seated.
A reading from the book of Revelation. I, John, had a vision of a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation, race, people, and tongue. They stood before the throne and before the Lamb, wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. Then one of the elders said to me, "These are the ones who have survived the time of great distress. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they stand before God's throne and worship him day and night in the temple. The one who sits on the throne will shelter them. They will not hunger or thirst anymore, nor will the sun or any heat strike them. For the Lamb who is in the center of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to springs of life-giving water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes."
The redeemed cried out in a loud voice.
Salvation comes from our God and from the Lamb.
To our God be blessing, glory, and wisdom.
Salvation comes from our God and from the Lamb.
It is through his writings that Bob's legacy and presence continue.
So Father Bob wrote, "Reconciliation is the work of God. God goes about restoring the damaged humanity of the victim. The victim, with humanity now restored, is once again the subject of his or her own history, and not simply an object which is acted upon by the wrongdoer."
You who once were far off have become near by the blood of Christ.
It
Please God to reconcile all things through Christ.
Father Bob wrote, "The gospel stories and global life experiences point to the pivotal role women play in suffering, violence, and reconciliation. They are the ones who find a nonviolent way out of violent situations. They teach others how to cope, to heal memories, and to move on. Perhaps that is why Jesus appeared first to women. They are the ones who most frequently lead acts of reconciliation that come to make a difference. They are the ambassadors of reconciliation par excellence."
We announce Jesus, love crucified. His blood reconciles earth with heaven.
Jesus gives peace and redemption to all.
Father Bob wrote, "Power to forgive comes ultimately from God. It is the power of the cross, the power arising out of the vulnerability of love. The ability to decide to forgive comes from the restoration of humanity, that is, the grace of reconciliation. That restoration comes from the God who loves and who forgives. God's love is what both restores the victim, and in making the victim a new creation, also makes forgiveness possible. Forgiveness is an acknowledgement that the victim is now a new creation and in a position to imagine a different future."
The cross of Christ is the sign of reconciliation.
In the blood of the new covenant.
Father Bob wrote, "A spirituality of reconciliation based on the resurrection is surely a spirituality for these times. In the resurrection of Jesus, we see the risen Lord at work in healing divisions and bringing about a new life. The call to us to be ministers of reconciliation, bringing near in the blood of Christ what was once far off, breaking down the wall of hostility that separates us, is a call to reconciliation rooted in truth and struggling for justice."
Let us present ourselves as ministers of God in the Holy Spirit in sincere love.
In the truth and in the power of God, in the Holy Spirit, in sincere love.
Please stand. With trust in God, we pray now as Jesus taught us.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
God of blessings, source of all holiness, the voice of your Spirit has drawn countless men and women to follow Jesus Christ and to bind themselves to you with a ready will and a loving heart. We remember Father Bob on this day and the many gifts that he shared with the world. On this day, as we inaugurate the Robert J. Schreiter Institute of Precious Blood Spirituality at Catholic Theological Union, we ask that through the intercession of Gaspar, Maria, Mother Brunner, and all those who celebrate with us in heaven this day, that this institute become known as a safe and sacred place for all who gather to learn more about precious blood spirituality. May all who come here be blessed and inspired by precious blood spirituality, to share their many gifts of precious blood spirituality throughout the world, longing for healing and hope. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns forever and ever.
Amen.
Peace is the ultimate gift of reconciliation. As we conclude our time of prayer, let us share in the sign of peace with one another. And let this peace extend into moving around the room, getting coffee and snacks, meeting old and new friends as we begin to build a reconciled community. Let us close with sharing God's peace with one another.
So good morning again, everybody. If you can have your seats, grab your coffee, grab whatever you need for the next about half hour, 45 minutes or so, we're going to begin. So once again, welcome. I'm so glad to see all of you here in person, everybody on Zoom. But for our official welcome, I'd like to invite up Vicki Otto, who's the Executive Director of the Precious Blood Spirituality Institute. So Vicki, please come on up.
So President Reed, Father Jeff, faculty, staff members, and all who gather here, both in person and virtually. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Precious Blood Spirituality Institute, it is my great pleasure to welcome you and thank you for coming today as we celebrate Father Bob and inaugurate the Schreiter Institute at CTU. When Kevin and I began our work with the Institute, we were honored that we could be instrumental in helping spread the news about the gifts of precious blood spirituality and the charism of the precious blood with the world. In a world so badly fractured, the gifts of reconciliation are sorely needed. We stand on the shoulders of many who came before us, including Father Bob, who dedicated their life's work to helping others around the world learn about our spirituality. We hope that our endeavors will honor their legacies. We're grateful to all our partners who join us, including CTU. It is heartening to know that the work that will be done here will help shape the leaders of our religious institutions of the future and embody a practical theology that emphasizes the praxis of reconciliation and restorative justice within our world and the church. We believe strongly that our future is very exciting. And I think that on this day that of Father Bob's birth, he's looking down from heaven and can't help but be pleased. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite up the president of Catholic Theological Union, Dr. Barbara Reed.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Vicki. Good morning and a very warm welcome to all of you, both those here in the room and those who are with us remotely. I am Sister Barbara Reed, president of Catholic Theological Union, and I'm delighted to add my welcome to that of Vicki. If you're new to CTU, although as I look around the room, I think most everybody is well familiar with CTU, but just in case there are some who are not as familiar with us, let me describe very briefly who we are. Catholic Theological Union was formed in 1968 when three men's communities, the Passionists, Franciscans, and Servites, joined efforts to respond to the call to rethink seminary formation in the wake of Vatican II. And so CTU was founded in this urban context, close to the University of Chicago and other schools of theology, where we could easily engage in ecumenical, intercultural, and interreligious exchanges. Today, 23 men's religious communities are the corporate owners of the school, and their students make up 40% of our student body. Another 20% of our students are women religious, and 40% are lay men and women, preparing for a great variety of ministries in the church. Our mission is to prepare effective leaders for the church, ready to witness to Christ's good news of justice, love, and peace. The Precious Blood missionaries have been a vital part of CTU since almost the very beginning. Bob Schreiter joined the faculty in 1974, and very soon thereafter took on the major leadership position as vice president and academic dean. And he served in that role for 9 years, from 1977 to 1986. I joined the faculty in '88, and his deanship was still legendary. I was in awe of him. I never dreamed that we would become good friends. He was in a whole other category. When I became dean in 2009 and then president in 2021, I frequently turned to him for guidance and wisdom. His work on reconciliation was known worldwide as he accompanied church leaders in various troubled places around the globe in peace building there and also here at CTU. Here he drew standing room only crowds of students to his courses every year. One year I remember sitting down with him when I was dean, and this was embarrassing to me to have to say, Bob, our classroom can't fit 80 students. We don't have any space that big. And he says, well, they can pull more chairs in, you know, he would never turn anyone away. And among his many contributions to CTU was his role in founding and guiding CTU's DMin program, Doctor of Ministry program. And he was always one of the most highly sought after directors of DMin thesis projects. His vision and wisdom shaped the Bernardine Center as its founding director. And he had a voluminous record of publications, setting a very high bar for his younger colleagues. Although he was highly sought after all over the globe, he always put CTU students and commitments first. He was most gracious in mentoring younger colleagues and becoming stellar teachers, outstanding scholars, and generous in serving CTU and the wider church. And one of those is Kevin Considine, who now serves as our director of the Schreiter Institute at CTU. When the Precious Blood missionaries, along with 3 congregations of Precious Blood sisters, approached CTU about endowing an institute at CTU that would preserve and promote the Precious Blood charism, particularly the ministries of peace building and reconciliation, we could not have been more pleased. And then after Bob's death, when they decided to name it for our beloved colleague, we were so delighted. I count myself most fortunate to have been part of Bob's circle of friends who celebrated birthdays together every year, when El Grupo, as we dubbed ourselves, would gather on or near December 14th, the actual day of his birthday. We would try to solve all the churches and world's thorniest problems. I know you're surprised they still exist. I'm very happy now to share this occasion with all of you as we give thanks for the extraordinary gift that Bob was to us, and as we continue the legacy of the ministry that he so profoundly promoted the world over. Thank you.
So thank you to Vicky Otto. Thank you to Sister Barbara for your welcoming remarks. Very much appreciated. So now we're going to turn to kind of our theme of the program, which is looking backwards into Bob's life, legacy, who he was, why we're here, and then looking forwards into the work of the Schreiter Institute at CTU. So I'd like to invite up Father Jeff Kirsch, who's going to talk a little bit about the looking backwards piece.
Good morning.
Good morning.
A special welcome to all of the people who are on Zoom. I see by the names, some of Bob's family members are also watching. So welcome especially to Jean and Mary, I believe, is on there as well. A couple months ago, when Kevin asked me if I'd be willing to be part of this initial launch of the Schreiter Institute, I said, sure, just let me know what you want me to do. My real assumption was, can you do the opening prayer? Then he came back a couple months ago and said, well, maybe you could, talk about Bob's legacy and his theology and everything he's done. I said, okay, I guess I can try to put something together. And then a couple weeks ago, he says, you have 15 minutes to do it. I'm not sure how you sum up Bob's scholarship and his ministry and his religious life in 15 minutes, but I'll try. As I was doing some of the research into Bob's work, going back through old papers and things that I have done, for those of you who don't know me, I guess I should have introduced myself. I am the provincial director for the Missionaries of the Precious Blood. In addition to that, I was one of Bob's students. He directed my dissertation. We were lifelong friends. We would vacation together. He was a real mentor to me and to like Kevin as well. And Kevin and I are actually classmates from our doctoral program. So we have all kinds of connections, and that was due to Bob. So as I offer these remarks, I do so not in a comprehensive way at all. I am going to give you a 30,000-foot view of what I think Bob's work was about. And so hopefully I can capture some of the threads that have run through all of his work. In a book that he co-edited with Mary Catherine Hilkert on Skillebeck's, his own mentor, The Praxis of the Reign of God. It's a good book if you haven't read it. He has in there, there's a line that speaks about Skillebeck's, his theological vision responding to the needs of the contemporary world. And that's what Skillebeck's tried to do. But Steve Bevins points out that that statement is just as true for Bob. Steve writes, Bob's theological vision has developed in response to the needs and experience of contemporary believers and those who would seek to believe. I think the first thing about all of Bob's work, whether it was in his more systematic work, in his spirituality work, in his reconciliation work, the term praxis is extremely important. Praxis. That thread will run through all of his work. It's about the experience that people have. And even in his own method, his own theological method, takes that into account. You can discern four basic characteristics of Bob's writing. First is, in all of his work, he had a commitment to work inductively. He was never just a theoretical theologian. He really took into account the context, the culture. Also, those of you who had Bob in class know that all of his work, especially his teaching, had a very rich narrative quality. He told stories. That's how he taught, by telling stories. He also, in all of his work, had a very deep concern for the brokenness of the world and the people who suffer in it. And I think the fourth characteristic that you can find in all of his writing is his strong Christological impetus, that everything goes back to Christ who shed his blood for us. Steve Bevins, in an essay in a Festschrift for Bob a couple years ago, spoke about Bob's work as a record, as an LP, a 33 1/3. And if you imagine that, you have on that record, you have the middle is a label where you have the songs and the label. And then you kind of go out from there and you have the different tracks. And then you have the edge. So for Bob's work, again, across all of his disciplines, the core, the label of the record is a spirituality of solidarity and hope. That notion of solidarity and hope characterizes all of Bob's work. In fact, he subtitled one of his early books, In Water and in Blood, A Spirituality of Solidarity and Hope. So that was at the core of all of Bob's work. And then the tracks, as you move out, are all of the tools that Bob used. If you, when he was in the 5401 building before they moved over here, if you ever went into Bob's office, what did you find? Books, stacks of books, dusty books, books in multiple languages. And I fondly remember one of the first times I went in as a first-year student at CTU when he gave me his keys, to take care of some of his stuff. He had a book on this coffee table at the top that was, I think it was entitled The Art of Bowling Alone. And I asked him what the book was. And it was a sociological text about the breakdown of community. Well, how many bowling leagues are out there anymore? Is anybody joining the Kiwanis anymore? And so he used tools like sociology to inform his theology. But it wasn't just sociology, it was also philosophy. I mean, the whole wide range of the social scientific tools. So he applied all that under the lens of spirituality, of solidarity, and hope. And then, as Bevins points out, that edge around the record are the different major themes that he dealt with throughout his career. Local theology, Catholicity, reconciliation. In some ways, those three broad categories offer a framework for Bob's life. His constructing local theologies, his Catholicity, New Catholicity, and then his various texts on reconciliation and peace building. Bob wrote in one of his books, it's a rather long quote, so bear with me. But I think this quote really does offer us a glimpse of his work. Schreiter writes, one set of problems emerges over and over again. How to be faithful to both the contemporary experience of the gospel and to the tradition of Christian life that has been received. How is a community to go about bringing to expression its own experience of Christ in its concrete situation? And how is this to be related to a tradition that is often expressed in language and concepts vastly different from anything in the current situation? And so it's that whole notion of how does the gospel, the church, and culture interact? At the beginning, I mentioned the importance of the word praxis. Bob, when he started to develop some new thoughts on precious blood spirituality, he did not sit down and decide, well, you know, the way we were being taught in the seminary back then, that's not good enough. We need to do something new. He didn't just sit down and think about, oh, well, let's redo precious blood spirituality. Instead, he was asked to, in the late 70s, he was asked to go to Chile. We had a vicariate in Chile. We had guys down there. And our guys down there, and one of them is on the Zoom. I think Father Barry Fisher is on the Zoom somewhere. This was during the dictatorship of Pinochet. And, excuse me. And our guys needed to figure out how to deal with people who are suffering from the dictatorship. And so they asked Bob to go down and give some retreats to them. They're a congregational retreat. And it was through those retreat talks that he began to develop some of these new ideas about precious blood spirituality, especially centering the spirituality on the three key concepts of cross, cup, and covenant. And I won't go into all of that. That could be a whole course. But what Bob did develop was this whole notion of the precious blood spirituality being all about solidarity and hope. But he did so, again, not in a purely intellectual way, but he was responding to real experience that people were suffering. And how do we bring the gospel to that experience and make sense for people? So for one of Bob's greatest legacies is that he, in some ways, led to the refounding of the missionaries of the precious blood throughout the world. Because if it wasn't for Bob's work in precious blood spirituality, not just the one book, but his continued development of these ideas, if it wasn't for that, our community would not be endowing an institute at CTU on precious blood spirituality, because all we would have would be some little prayers, the devotional side of it. But Bob really helped us develop a spirituality as opposed to simply a devotion. Bob also, one of his legacies is not just the spirituality, but also in our own congregational history. Bob played a central role officially for 12 years as a general counselor, but unofficially for most of basically his entire life in the community as being one of the leaders of our community. He was internationally respected. Bob was the person you went to when there was an issue in one of our units across the world. Bob would be the one who would, write different interventions when we had members who maybe were at a synod of bishops. Bob was the resource. So for us as missionaries of the precious blood, he certainly had a great and profound effect on the direction of our community. But if we look a little closer at his theology, his work that he's done here at CTU. And interestingly enough, I don't know if you noticed what Barbara said. He began working here in 74, correct? He was ordained in 75. Bob's always been a little out of sync, I guess. Usually you get ordained a priest, then you go get your ministry. But Bob started before he was even ordained a priest. And in fact, originally, as I was cleaning out Bob's office and his house and going through his papers, originally Bob was not supposed to come to CTU. He was not slated to come here. He was slated, he went off to Nijmegen under a benefactor from St. Joseph's College, Frank McHale. Frank McHale was a lawyer for the Nickel Plate Railroad. He was a bachelor and never had kids. And he sponsored seminarians to go to Europe to study. He was from Indianapolis and he sponsored archdiocesan seminarians. And as an alum of St. Joseph's College, which the Precious Blood sponsor, also some of our seminarians. And so when Bob went to Nijmegen, the idea was he was supposed to come back to St. Joseph's College and teach theology there. Well, when he finished up at Nijmegen and then finished his postdoctoral work at Oxford, he came back and there was no space at St. Joseph's College for him. They had enough theology professors. And I think based on some of the letters from the academic dean at St. Joseph's at the time, it was clear that Bob's expertise would have been wasted probably at St. Joseph's College. He would not have had nearly the profound effect he had on the church and the world if he would have stayed at Rensselaer. Now, he would have made a great undergraduate theology professor, no question about that. But his talents would have been wasted on undergrads. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, though. Kevin told me to throw in some anecdotes, so but back to Bob's theology. Local Theology was one of his first books, Constructing Local Theology. And what we can see in that, again, his method is important. That book grew out of an encounter with students at CTU in the late 70s and early 80s who were from all around the world, trying to make sense of how does the gospel, as it's been taught and preached in a certain method, in a certain way, a certain style, that just did not resonate with their own experiences coming from international places. And so as he began to encounter these students and work with them, he began to develop this Constructing Local Theology. And basically, that can be applied not only in terms of internationality, but also in terms of place. For example, Bob went to St. Joseph's College and worked with the faculty for a number of sessions on the faculty there developing their own, constructing their own local theology at the college. What does it mean to be a Precious Blood college in the early 80s, you know, serving, 1,200 undergraduate students? And it's constructing local theologies can be basically boiled down to this dialogue between gospel, church, and culture. What is the message? How is the message preached? And what's the context that's being preached in? Context has always been important for Bob. His next work on the New Catholicity was developed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's a whole new context in Europe. It's a whole new context in the world, because now it's a globalized world. It was the beginning of a serious study on globalization. And while in constructing local theologies, he kind of took an approach to culture as an integration, that culture was whole. You have a culture. By the time we get to New Catholicity, his notions of culture, it's a fractured culture. You can't talk about a culture. It's multicultural. And so how does the gospel get preached and understood in a culture that is diverse, but not just diverse, but also broken? A culture of suffering, a culture of death. And so for Bob, he reached back into the Christian tradition and saw Catholicity, that notion, that attribute, that mark of the church, Catholicity. That concept is attentive to both the local and to the universal. And so it was a way to bridge between the local and the universal. How do you bring, it's about wholeness, not identity, but wholeness. Wholeness also, I think, was one of the hallmarks of Bob's work in reconciliation. One of my jobs when I worked for Bob for those 4 years was I kept track of his bibliography, added to it all the time. And you can see in Bob's bibliography, I don't want to call them trends. So in the, I think it was the late 80s, early 90s, Bob wrote a lot of articles about the Catholic Church in China. And I asked, well, how did you, well, somebody asked him and he did, and then everyone else asked him. And so he had all these articles about the Catholic Church in China. But then you get towards, you know, the 90s, the mid 90s, and you see all of this reconciliation stuff starts. And Bob's work in reconciliation is intimately tied with fresh blood spirituality. It grew out of it. But again, for Bob, and I'm not going to go through his theology of reconciliation. Kevin can do that at another time. But for Bob, it wasn't just theologizing about reconciliation. It was about the praxis of it. He went to Rwanda. He went to the Philippines. He went to other places that were suffering. And in all of that, it was very clear, and this is something that Bob would drill into his students' heads, that reconciliation is not a program. It's not a strategy. It's not a how-to manual. It's a spirituality. And it's God's work. But it doesn't mean that we just sit back and wait. We, as the church, it is our responsibility to create a space for truth, for justice, for healing, and for new possibilities. I'm not sure how many of you knew this, but for about 10 years, Bob was a consultant with Caritas, the International Catholic Relief Organization that Catholic Relief Services we've part of. And Bob, and I believe his name was Duncan McGinnis, I think was the director at the time of Caritas. Bob wrote their peacemaking manual that is used throughout the world. It shows you again how he was concerned not just with the intellectual side of his work, but with how does his work really make an impact in the world. I want to end with going back to kind of where we began. When Bob was working on the retreats in Chile in the late 70s, that became In Water and in Blood one of his first texts. When the second edition came out, second or third edition came out, I don't know, about 10 years ago, and Bob wrote a new introduction. He was talking about cross, cup, and covenant, the three central elements of precious blood spirituality. But he said that really covenant is the primary one. Covenant is the primary image for precious blood spirituality. And I'm going to list off 4 reasons why he says that. And I guess I would challenge you, as you hear these 4 reasons that Bob puts out, think about how these themes are throughout all of his work. If you had Bob in class, if you knew him, if you knew his work, think about how these 4 statements can be found from the very beginning in constructing local theologies all the way to the end. Bob says that the covenant between God and the Hebrews is signed in blood. And this does 4 things. 1, it makes a new creation of an oppressed people. 2, it is the basis of an abiding relationship between these people and God. And 3, it restores the personal dignity and the right relationship in community. And 4, it creates a nation that is to be a witness in a broken world to the steadfast faithfulness of God. I think in those 4 statements, you can find almost all of Bob's primary areas of study. One last anecdote, and then I'll return to my spot. If you ever had Bob in class, one of the amazing things is that if you would go up like during the break, because he always had those long classes at night, and you go up during the break, and if you look at the podium, and here he's been for an hour and a half teaching, and just and spot on, and you look to see what his notes are. Anybody ever look at them? It is just an outline with some words. I mean, there is no text other than, one line, and he teaches that way, taught that way. His work will continue on through the work of the PBSI and the Schreiter Institute, but I think most importantly, his work will continue on through his students who are now all around the world. Thank you. One last thing, if you want a good introduction to Bob's work, if you could find the Interreligious Studies and Intercultural Theology, volume 3.1 and 2, 2019. This was a Festschrift for Bob. Excellent articles. I think, Ton, you have an article in here, don't you?
No,
Oh.
it's online though. So
Okay, it's online. So check it out. It's a great introduction to Bob's work.
So first of all, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to Father Jeff for doing the impossible task, which is doing great justice to Bob's life, his legacy, his work, his memory in such a short amount of time. So can we please give him one more round of applause? So Father Jeff did such a good job with the looking backwards piece as to who Bob was. Without Bob, none of us would be here in this room. Without the precious bloods, none of us would be here, right? So I had the relatively less difficult job of like looking forward, right? So trying to cast a vision for now that Bob is no longer with us, and now that the spirituality is one that is powerful, can change lives, and still needs to be passed on. How do we engage in that work? So allow me to introduce myself very briefly. And my name is Dr. Kevin Considine, and I'm the inaugural director of the Robert J. Schreiter Institute for Precious Blood Spirituality here at Catholic Theological Union. So it's a very, very long title. I want me to find maybe some good initials for, but it's an honor and a privilege to be standing here and speaking to all of you. And I mean that for real, because I met Bob for the first time in 2005 in the Christology and Cultures class across the building, across the way in the old building. And from there, I just discerned to be an MA student instead of an MDiv student. And Bob was assigned as my thesis advisor, or as my academic advisor here at CTU. Did a number of independent studies with him. He ended up being my thesis advisor. And then after that, we kept in touch for the next 10, 15 years by having lunch about once a month. And so just to honor Bob before I kind of move forward with kind of like casting the vision, and just so you know, y'all are going to help me out with that in about 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to cast a vision together. I'm going to set them up and hopefully you'll knock them down with some of your great ideas to assist as well. But I want to read something that I wrote not too long after Bob passed. It's a part of a longer piece. It was a monthly routine. One afternoon each month, we would meet for lunch at the same local restaurant. We would take turns saying the blessing and paying the bill. Occasionally, I would bring one of my sons with me if they were not in school. That always gave Bob a chuckle. Because one time, I think my son was 9 months. The next time he saw me, he was like 18 months. So he saw my kids grow up a fair amount. So over a meal and hot tea, we'd spend several hours catching up, talking theology, ministry, family, and books, and simply enjoying each other's company. We would swap stories, which would sometimes end in laughter, and other times in a knowing silence. I would pick his brain and seek advice. He would reassure me that all was well, assist with writing countless recommendations for jobs, or look over a draft of whatever I was writing at the time. I would offer a kind ear to him in return and ask how he was taking care of himself, because as everyone probably knows, that was not Bob's strong suit. It turned into a regular occurrence, and we continued this monthly for 10 years, more or less. And so Robert J. Schreiter, or Bob, after about 5 years, I think he finally got upset with me and said, "Kevin, stop calling me Dr. Schreiter. You have to call me Bob." For me, it's just a respect type thing. I just such kind of like awe of this person that I wanted to never not show respect. And one time he just got upset with me. He's like, "Kevin, I'm Bob's. Drop the doctor stuff. It's Bob from now on." But although he was globally renowned for his ministry in enculturation, intercultural dialogue, social reconciliation, and peacemaking in the aftermath of dictatorships, violence, and genocide, also to me and many others, his was a spirituality of mentorship. He mentored countless students throughout his life, and I was privileged enough to be one of them. Bob was generous with his time, talents, and person. He might email me from an airport after reading an essay on a plane, or he may agree to meet for lunch during a 48-hour quote-unquote layover here in Chicago. And he came back from giving a lecture in Germany, came back for 48 hours, and he was off to Rwanda to conduct a retreat or a seminar on peace and reconciliation after genocide. And mind you, all this was while he was also teaching classes for hundreds of students, writing books and articles, serving on dissertation committees, directing theses, serving in a leadership capacity for the Precious Bloods, speaking and responding to international conferences, mentoring many other students. I could go on and on and on. The number of balls that Bob juggled at one time is absolutely astonishing. But in my own life, again, Schreiter advised my master's thesis, taught me in independent studies in his office, guided much of my dissertation, wrote the foreword to my book, inserted me into my first and only plenary speaking engagement at a conference celebrating Edward Schillebeeckx, read drafts of most of my articles, and believed in me probably more than I ever believed in myself. He embodied the spirituality of mentorship, because a mentor has faith in their students, perhaps more than the student has in themselves, and empowers them to follow the still small voice of God's Spirit wherever it is that voice might lead. So as we remember Bob and start looking forward, may we all be so blessed by a mentor friendship. May we all learn to live as mentors to others when called, and may we all follow in these footsteps. So now is the time is to start looking forward, looking towards the future. And so in my short remarks here, there's kind of just 3 basic questions I want to touch upon. And then, like I said, I'm passing it on to everyone in this room. You're going to help us think this through, and we're going to kind of like workshop this together a little bit. And the 3 questions are simply this: the Schreiter Institute at CTU, why now? Like, why at this point in history? Secondly, how is this institute rooted in this thing called precious blood spirituality? And then third, the most pragmatic part, the mission, vision, and what is our early programming? Like what is going to happen or has been happening in these first few months? Because as you may or may not know, we were born on July 5th. So if we're 6 months old, we're still in diapers, kind of like toddling around, trying to figure our way around the place. So we're getting there, but have a long way to go. So why now? And so the simple answer to that question is, like everyone was saying, that the precious blood communities, including the missionaries, the adorers, the sisters, along with everybody else, we're figuring out a way, how do we pass along this spirituality that has been so powerful and so transformative to so many people, especially when all in all vocations tend to be declining and the spirituality so many people have found transformative. It's one that needs to be passed on in some way, shape, or form. In other words, folks looked out and saw that the world is in need of the spirituality. The world is in need of this thing called reconciliation. So reconciliation, again, not as like cheap grace, not as an easy way to like reward the oppressors and screw over the oppressed, but reconciliation truly as God's work that we participate in that makes a new creation out of both victim and wrongdoer, something that no one can imagine but God, but we trust God and go through the process, that something good will arise on the other side. So all of us know we don't have to look very far in the newspapers, in our own families, in our lives, communities, that the world is in desperate need of like this charism of reconciliation. And so for anybody in the room who's a little foggy on precious blood spirituality, this is a long quote, but kind of the joke goes that if you get 4 or 5 folks from the various congregations of the precious blood in the same room, you get 4 or 5 different understandings of what precious blood spirituality is. So take what I'm offering with a grain of salt. I just grabbed this from the website because it made sense to me and it resonated with pretty much everything that Bob has written. I'm going to read this out loud, not because I think that you all can't read, but because sometimes when you hear something proclaimed, your brain processes it a little bit differently. So I just want you to hear this spoken out loud. So precious blood spirituality calls for inclusion, for seeking out people who feel unloved, rejected, and alone in the same way that Christ seeks them out. Because Jesus shed his blood to bring reconciliation, love, and hope to each and every one of us. The missionaries, and may I add the adorers, the sisters, the associates, and everyone who is motivated by this charism of the precious blood, seek to spread this reconciling love to everyone, especially the lost, the hopeless, the poor, and victims of violence. Anyone who feels left out of the circle of God's love. Now you notice there that that word anyone is underlined, italicized, bolded, everything I could throw at it, right? So that's something that I did. That's not, you won't find that on the website. But this, I think, is kind of one of the key takeaways as we look forward as how it is that the spirituality will carry on, is that if it truly is God's work in which we participate, we don't do the picking and the choosing as, okay, who is the one who gets to be part of the family? Who's the one who gets left out? This person's worthy of forgiveness and reconciliation. This person is not. What Bob taught us through his writings and kind of what's caught in this mission statement is, no, that is not for us to decide. Basically, we respond to invitations that are given to us. We respond to calls. And by doing so, we realize that anyone who feels left out of the circle of God's love, doesn't matter who that person is, doesn't matter what we think of them, that has nothing to do with it. Just because they are a child of God, the precious blood spirituality calls us to respond to that person as a full human person and accompany them in the spirit of God in whichever way that God wants to lead that to go. But I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. Anybody who feels left out of the circle of God's love. And so these two, as far as the Schreiter Institute at CTU goes, again, I'm not going to read both of these, but I'm going to read the first one for the same reason why I just vocalized the last quote, just so you can hear it out loud and your brains can cognitively process it in that way. So based upon all this, based upon kind of what Sister Barbara was saying, what Vicki was saying, what Father Jeff was saying, what we've heard so far, the mission of the Schreiter Institute is to foster the further development of a practical theology of the precious blood and the promotion of the spirituality. Again, the word spirituality, not kind of like a program, not a goal, not a kind of like a how-to manual, because like Bob always said, this is a messy process with an uncertain outcome. So spirituality, which embodies that theology through focused academic scholarship, a program of pastoral education, which emphasizes the praxis of reconciliation. So as the Schreiter Institute, as we get moving, we're toddling around now in diapers in our first 5-6 months and moving into like the second half of our first year. This is kind of our motivating factor. But again, the spirituality of the precious blood, the spirituality that we try to harmonize with God's presence in whatever way we are able to, and trust that it's God's work. God will lead us if we discern and can flow with God's Spirit as God's Spirit flows. So having said that, I'm going to want to move into the more practical aspects. So that's kind of like the theological, spiritual, all those sorts of things. But practically, okay, what the heck are we going to be doing at this institute? I'm sure people are very, very curious about the specifics. So there's 3 main foci of the Schreiter Institute. The first one is scholarship. And for a number of reasons. The first reason simply is Bob was an internationally renowned scholar. And so to honor his legacy, the Institute must do 2 things. One is rigorous academic scholarship. And second is on the ground practitioners and work, getting your hands dirty. Because for Bob, it was a both and. It wasn't an either or. It wasn't kind of like the academy or the community. It was both together, constantly informing each other. It could never be one or the other. But the other important piece, why it is that scholarship, and scholarship not in the sense of money, although maybe someday we can give scholarships out to the Institute, we shall see. But scholarship in the sense, again, of kind of like academic discourse. And as you'll see here, hearing, interpreting, understanding, and responding to the cries of the blood. Now, here's kind of what this means. So a lot of times we think that scholarship, we pick up a book and it's great, we gain some knowledge, we move on with it, right? But I want us to think of scholarship through kind of like an older word, the root of asceticism, ascesis, which is a kind of purification, a kind of way that we are able to become better. Because as Bob noticed, and as anybody else can notice, we're constantly blinded by bias, constantly blinded by our context. We're constantly blinded by things we don't even know that we're blinded by. So at its best, what good scholarship in the tradition of the precious blood can do is take us through that process of ascesis, that process of purification, so that we realize what our biases are, realize what our prejudices are, realize what those blind spots are. Because once we're able to recognize that, then that bias can no longer get in the way of me hearing the cry of somebody else who's in need. So again, scholarship is hearing, interpreting, understanding, and responding to the cries of the blood. And so in the first year, the main way that we're going to go about this is put it on your calendar, May 12th and 13th. We're having our spring symposium, which is going to be called The Praxis of Reconciliation, focusing on trauma, culture, and spirituality. Now, the symposium itself is going to be about a day and a half, have 4 sessions. But the idea is simply this. Looking at this word trauma, which is one that is very much there in contemporary discourse. But also when we bring it into dialogue with spirituality and with culture, we see that the word trauma, there's a lot we can learn from it, a lot there that can be useful. But as you start moving cross-culturally, the word trauma sometimes becomes unintelligible. It has a different kind of domain that it works in. So trauma sometimes works cross-culturally, sometimes does not. So again, the point of the symposium is bringing together panels that are going to look at how these 3 things do and do not go together. And each panel is going to be composed of 1 established academic, 1 artist or practitioner or community organizer, and then 1 person who's either a younger scholar or a graduate student. Now, the reason for this, again, is honoring Bob's legacy of being kind of like both, an academic, intellectual genius almost, but at the same time being very hands in the dirt and being really focused on how these things work out in real life. So the idea is by getting kind of like our established scholars together with artists and practitioners, together with younger scholars, we can have these great conversations and community building for how then that if the Schreiter Institute is trying to kind of be a little bit of a nerve center and be a good partner in like the larger work, both here in Chicago, nationally and globally, in restorative justice and reconciliation. This gives us a good starting point for how it is that we become a good partner. It can share the spirituality in a way that is authentic, but also in a way that is inviting, and one that is very much in the way that Bob practiced it. And a few other things, I'm not going to go through all of these, but again, this is more pie in the sky stuff, lecture series, colloquia, scholarly resources, that stuff will be coming. My own publications are focusing more and more in the realm of reconciliation, picking up on Bob's work a little bit. So, but that's a little bit on the first foci, which is scholarship. And these are two of Bob's book. There's the In Water, in Blood, the spirituality book that Father Jeff was talking about. Then this peace building book that was part of the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame, which is used all around the nation as well. Okay, so the second foci is teaching. So if the scholarship is kind of that ascetical moment, right, where we're trying to overcome our biases, know what they are first, all those sorts of things, to be able to hear the cry of the blood. And teaching is then the community aspect. How do we disciple others and in communities be held accountable for as well, hearing, interpreting, understanding, and responding to the cries of the blood, the cries of those who suffer, the cries of anybody who feels that they are left out of God's love, no matter who they are, where they're from, what they look like, no matter what we think of them, what our prejudices and biases are, realizing that we have to disciple others and teach others to engage in this process as well. And so as the Schreiter Institute gets moving, the main thing that we're working on right now, and this is still in the process, this is not a done deal, but working on an accredited certificate in reconciliation and restorative justice. And this is here at CTU. And so let me translate that word certificate, because that can mean 5 different things to 5 different people. Here at CTU, when folks take a master's degree, whether it's an MDiv, an MA, Master of Arts in Pastoral Studies, instead of having a specific concentration, there's usually a certificate takes the place of kind of like that concentration. And so we're in the midst of developing a certificate in reconciliation and restorative justice that will be kind of like the academic foundation for folks who are interested in how it is that reconciliation and restorative justice can be part and parcel of graduate studies. It's workshops and seminars and course offerings. So again, I'm privileged enough to be both faculty and staff here at CTU. So I'll be teaching my first course this coming May. It's called Reconciliation and Praxis of Salvation. And then my second course, tentatively, will be teaching the following May. It's called The Quest for Reconciling Narratives, the Theology of Robert J. Schreiter for 21st Century Contexts. So again, how is it then that we teach and promote this work of reconciliation? And how is it that we disciple others to hear, interpret, understand, and respond to the cries of the blood? And teacher, practitioner, scholar in residence, that's more pie in the sky stuff, just to kind of fill that out. Oh, and something Father Jeff was talking about, the peace building Caritas training manual. That's right here, front and center. I remember one time talking to Bob before he passed and before COVID, he mentioned that one of his most proud achievements was the fact that he got to write this field manual for practitioners that are trying to do the work of peace building. He has all these amazing books, local theologies, New Catholicity, but he said, this field manual for him was kind of like the pinnacle achievement of all of his writings. Okay, so our third foci then is praxis and collaborations. Because again, we don't live in a vacuum. We don't exist in a vacuum. We need people to collaborate with. We need to figure out how can we be good neighbors and how can we contribute to this larger work that's already being done in many different places. And this as embraced and accompanying presence wherever the blood cries out. Again, that idea that anybody who feels outside of the purview of God's love, wherever this is, wherever there is an invitation, that is where we need to be. And so the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation long predates me, and Father David Kelly is here and other folks from PBMR. PBMR goes almost its reputation precedes it. I don't need to say a whole lot about PBMR, except that if you don't know who they are, please talk to them because they've been doing amazing, amazing work for, Dave, it's been 30 years? 20 years, 20 years. So what we've been up to in the first kind of 6 months. So I partnered with this group called Sankofa Journeys. And what this is a pilgrimage that you go to the main sites of the Black freedom struggle in the South to try to be equipped for when you come back home. How do you pass on this history and how do you work for racial justice in your own context? And that's run by one of our friends in the Evangelical Covenant Church through North Park Seminary here. Another collaborator, we're working with the Silk Road Rising, which is a theater company here in Chicago, founded after 9/11. And the two founders were Syriac Christian and Pakistani Muslim. And together they realized that after 9/11, they needed to tell the stories of what they call the Silk Road diaspora in a way that made sense. And because of all the negative narratives that were out there. And so in the next few months, myself, the Pathways program, with Dr. Karen Ross is the director of the Center for the Study of Consecrated Life, which Sister Chioma is the director of, and the Tolton program here, which Dr. Kimberly Limore is the director of. We're kind of like co-sponsoring this in order to bring the voices of Black teens in Chicago to seminarians here at CTU and make that dialogue happen. And so another thing we have on tap for this spring is a collaboration with a group called Project FIRE, which stands for Fearless Initiative for Recovery and Empowerment. And they're an organization that's been around for about 10 to 12 years, more or less. But in a nutshell, what they do is youth who are victims of violence, either direct victims in their bodies or witnesses of violence, they walk through healing processes through the art of glass blowing. Because they found out over the years that when youth who either have been witnesses or victims of violence are brought into that purview of working with very dangerous materials, because I don't know what the numbers are, but a furnace is something like 1,000 degrees, something ridiculous like that, right? So when they're in that setting that's already dangerous and they have to rely on teamwork and that team members in that setting as well, there's something elemental that happens, something ritualistic that happens that leads to a kind of healing. And so we're going to partner with them, and they're working on a project that's going to commemorate the 1919 Chicago race riots. And so in April, we're going to host a gallery here, have them displayed here first before they're installed around Chicago, and then have kind of like conversations with the artists, conversations with the youth and the folks who work there. And one thing, I didn't know whether to put this up here or not, but I figured, hey, what the heck, why not? Let you know what we're up to. This is just in the very, very initial feeling out phases, but also was invited recently to a meeting with the Catholic Native Boarding School Accountability and Healing Project. And again, this is in the very initial stages, like meeting kind of 2 meetings, but in the sense of what Bob did. When Bob was invited someplace, he showed up, listened, and said, if I can be of help, great. If I can't, well, no worries. So we're in the initial stages of meeting with the Accountability and Healing Project to figure out how we can assist the survivors of the boarding schools in the healing and the reconciliation that they are seeking. Okay, so that's about the end of me talking at you. So now I'm going to put the ball in your court. And so Sister Bernadine, for folks on Zoom, she's going to put you into Zoom rooms here in a moment, in breakout rooms. But here's the protocol that I want you to use. So you've heard a lot over the past, I'm guessing hour and a half, right? I'm going to use a protocol that was taught to me by, his name was Dr. John McCarthy when I was a doctoral student at Loyola Chicago. And this is called a striking point, a sticking point, and a question. So if you're here in the room, your table is going to be kind of like your small group. If you're on Zoom, again, Sister Bernadine will put you in a breakout room. But I want you to have about a 10-15 minute discussion. And if you're here in person, you need to walk around, grab some food, stretch your legs, please do that as well. But a striking point is kind of like thumbs up. Okay, here's something that I heard I agree with. I like it. I'm on board with it. It resonates with me, kind of like thumbs up. So a sticking point. So you see the thumbs down kind of emoji there, right? So that's kind of a sticking point, but a sticking point can also be something that you're unclear about. Something that's like sticking because it doesn't quite sit well with you, you don't understand it, not too sure about that one, but a sticking point can either be a thumbs down, a thumbs in the middle, a point of clarification, but something that you heard that you're like, wait a second, hit the stop button, rewind. Can you say that again, or help me understand better what you're talking about, or just say, you know what, that sounds like a completely horrible idea. Please don't do that. For real. And then a question about anything that I've gone over with the Schreiter Institute, ideally, but also from anything that Father Jeff has given us, that Vicky Otto has given us, that Sister Barbara has given us, but whatever questions are still like lingering there in your minds. And what I would like to do is, since Zoom folks haven't been able to get you involved so much in the program so far, let's start off with folks on Zoom. So I know that you're put in rooms kind of randomly, but each room should have had a recorder. So I'm hoping if folks on Zoom, the recorders can start speaking back to us and enlighten us with your wisdom, like striking point, sticking point question, and any other thoughts about what you've heard so far this morning. Not everybody at once.
So shall I go for my group?
Go ahead.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So hello everybody. I'm Pauline Collentine. I'm in the UK. I'm at York St John University. So in my group, the three of us thought it was all exciting, very interesting and wonderful. Not only that the Institute has been established, but also the proposed program of activities, Kevin, that you outlined. So there were no sticking points. We had 3 quick questions, if that's okay. Is that allowed?
Yes, please go ahead. Questions are great.
First of all, you talked about the practice and collaboration work that you're going to be doing. We'd like to know a little bit more about what the kind of work is that you're going to be doing on religious boarding schools, and also on the work on racial justice. The second question is, we're picked up on the project work that you're planning to do with the Silk Road Rising, which we understand was founded by a Christian and a Muslim. And so a question there, to what extent will there be quite a lot of will there be more interreligious work going on with other projects as you evolve? And the third question is the online course, looking at which is an accredited certificate in reconciliation and restorative justice that you mentioned. Are you envisaging that will be online as well? Because we thought that would really be a very important way, not of only spreading this whole theology and the work to people in the vast places of the United States, but also worldwide as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And Pauline, thank you so much for joining us from across the pond. Really appreciate you being here.
You're welcome.
So let me address all 3 of those very quickly. The answers are probably going to be a little bit less than stellar, just because, again, we're kind of 5 months old and we're toddling around in diapers, but I can give you my best thoughts at this point. So as far as the collaboration with both the accountability project with the boarding schools and the racial justice initiative. So with the boarding schools, it's literally in the most introductory stages of just like meeting, trying to understand each other a little bit and see what it is, how it is we might be able to be partners and collaborators. So we're kind of at that very initial kind of like getting to know each other, see what our assets are and how it is that we might or might not be able to help each other out. So with the boarding schools, again, we're at the very, I would even say at the beginning, if there's a pre-beginning, that's kind of where we are, just like having conversations, and we're seeing that our missions are aligning. Now we're moving into kind of, okay, so our missions align, here's kind of what each of us are doing. So now we're moving into meetings probably in the new year to see how can we actually collaborate or create a plan to be of assistance in some way, shape, or form. And as far as the racial justice question goes, so with the Sankofa journey that I went on, the goal is, well, the pilgrimage itself is run by this place called the Evangelical Covenant Church. And so I'm hoping that the Schreiter Institute, again, that this is, I'm talking kind of like pie in the sky. This is like nothing that's like budgeted just yet. But I'm hoping that the Schreiter Institute will be able to continue to help folks to go on this pilgrimage. Because again, the pilgrimage isn't just kind of like a tourism type thing. It's highly curated. It has prayer. It has documentaries. You're partnered up with someone of a different racial background, because the basis of this was the freedom rides back in the 60s. And so the idea is you're with somebody for 3 days of a different racial and ethnic background, having difficult conversations, going through difficult things, but as kind of like a Christian community. And so the idea is we're trying to equip people for when they go back to their own local context to be able to discern, okay, how is it that what I learned here on the pilgrimage, how can I implement this in some way, shape, or form now wherever I'm from, whether it's from, there are folks from Chicago, folks from the Bronx in New York, there are folks from Florida, California, you name it. There are 40 of us on the bus from all over the place. But as far as kind of like the longer term, kind of like collaboration for racial justice, at least focusing in the US, a lot of my own work, both scholarship and then also ministry work has been in this area. So although again, we're still kind of like 6 months old and toddling around, but I know that it's going to be something that's going to be one of the main threads of what the Schreiter Institute, what we're up to here, just because of my own involvement with racial justice and the ways I'm trying to make these collaborations to make that just kind of like a shared ministry all around CTU and with our partners. So with the interreligious were questions. So again, tentatively, pie in the sky answer is yes, definitely 100%. That is something that is on our horizons. Now, has there been any like specific programming or program planning towards that end other than this collaboration with Silk Road Rising? Not as of yet. So again, it's something that moving slowly in that direction is going to see what will emerge. But Silk Road Rising is a theater that I've had connections with for about 10 or 15 years now. So again, just trying to kind of like take small steps. But again, in the big scheme of things, in a perfect world, yes. But how that's going to shake out, not quite sure just yet. And as far as the certificate and the courses, so again, ideally, we would like it to be either bimodal, online. Those discussions are ongoing right now. So again, I can't give you kind of like the perfect answer that would be more helpful. But what I can say is that, again, in an ideal perfect world, we would be able to do that. But that's a discussion we have to have here inside of the committees and the faculty as well.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Pauline. So other folks on Zoom, any recorders want to chime their voices in?
Sure. Hi there, everyone. I'm Caitlin Morneau, zooming in from Washington, D.C. I'm a current student at CTU and also work out here with Catholic Mobilizing Network. So just, yeah, and in our small group, just lots of appreciation for both the work of the center and hearing about the vision, and for me and my conversation partner appreciating how this time helped us to put what we, the bits that we knew and know about Father Schreiter into the context of his life, and painting that broader picture. We really appreciate how this time has done that. We also had a lot of appreciation and hope for the Native Boarding School Healing collaborations, and we're really struck. I can't remember which one was the positive one, but it's in a good way. Struck by the invitation that this charism is available to everyone. And so I think, a question that maybe emerged related to that, and I think you've covered with respect to remote opportunities, particularly in the certificate, but curious about what the opportunities for engagement will look like over time, both for those who are local to Chicago and those who are not. So acknowledging that you shared a number of opportunities, and some things may still be in formation, but just eager to learn about those as they arise.
Right, Caitlin, thank you. And thank you for tuning in from the East Coast. Appreciate it. So let me just say a quick word as far as the engagement piece. And this allows me to do some shameless promotion of the Schreiter Institute. So I appreciate that setup. So as far as things that you can tune in for, so when we do it's all the way in April, but when we have the gallery here, there's the conversations we have with the artists, that's going to be bimodal as well. So whether folks are in person or in the UK, on the East Coast of the US, other places, we want to make sure that the accessibility is never a huge barrier for folks who have interest in the work of reconciliation. And with the symposium coming up in May also, that's going to take a lot more kind of like digital know-how than I have. But again, the idea is that a lot of that would be bimodal as well, so folks can join in from afar. But to kind of just get to the crux of your question is as far as kind of like engagement and accessibility, that we're trying to make it so that engagement and accessibility, there'll always be an obstacle there that we can't ever fully get rid of. But we're trying to make that obstacle as small as possible so that engagement with the Schreiter Institute, our programming, Precious Blood Spirituality, is as available to as many people as possible. And then the more obstacles we find out, the more we realize, okay, here's how we have to pivot and make sure that people have better access. Hey, Caitlin, thank you. So anybody else on Zoom want to chime in before I think there are one or two more Zoom groups?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'll respond. Thank you, Kevin. My name is Dan Scheid. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at Duquesne University. Proud CTU alum from even, I think, before Kevin. Our group had a lot of appreciation for what was shared. I think balancing academic scholarship with engagement with the community, equipping practitioners to go out and be ministers of reconciliation. I think that kind of balance is excellent. One of the questions we kind of joked, Bob had just an amazing bandwidth that he could respond to every invitation and manage all of them. And I can't. You might, but one of the questions was, of all the many good initiatives you mentioned, what do you want to prioritize, and which invitations do you want to respond to? And one question or concern that came up was, for my dialogue partner in rural Ohio, she said many of the interests that were mentioned would sound like typical Chicago, maybe liberal theology that would not reach them, even though they were very much committed to precious blood spirituality. So perhaps one question is, how are you going to balance the invitations that come to you, and how might you broaden that nationally, internationally, to make sure the mission of making sure no one is excluded from the circle of God's love is excellent, but so that as many of those interests are represented in your work. And one idea that came up, at least for me, in America, political divisions are so strong. For example, we can't hear each other very well. So I just wonder if some kind of listening circles for the political divide, and at least in America, maybe globally, also in our church, could be a really good representation of reconciliation as one kind of project. I don't know what it would look like, but much like what you are talking about in terms of Sankofa, but for our political divides between rural, urban, red, blue, something like that. So, but otherwise, just all appreciation for many of the wonderful things you're leading forward. Thank you.
All right, Dan, thank you. And so let me just say a few words about both those. So the first about bandwidth, that is an excellent question. And unlike Bob, I'm not a celibate priest. I have amazing spouses here, and we have 2 kids. So all those other responsibilities, I know my bandwidth is very limited. So that's going to be an ongoing struggle in the first kind of like 6 months to a year to figure out how is it that if and when folks reach out to us, how we're able to respond. And then what larger networks of partnerships have we created that, again, if the Schreiter Institute is not able to do something, how do we have the partners and kind of like the bandwidth among, let's say, I'm just going to make up a number, 10 community partners, that if we can't do it, then maybe Precious Blood Spirituality Institute could do it, or there could be other, or PBMR or even other community partners, so that it's not just kind of like coming to us, and then if we can't do it, somebody's screwed it because they're not going to be able to receive any assistance. So part of the plan is to try to create a larger network of partners or collaborations so that the bandwidth is extended. Now, I don't think there ever will be enough bandwidth. Like you mentioned, Bob, how he did like 10,000 things every day, all day, I have no clue. But I definitely am not Bob, and not even going to attempt to fill those shoes. But I figure if we get a larger of enough community, kind of like all on the same page, and those relationships built, then that at least gives us more bandwidth. And probably will never be enough, but it'll give us the ability to do more as kind of like maybe a shared coalition might be a good word. Now, to your second point, as far as kind of like very Chicago centric, and yes, that's both the strength and the weakness of the program that I've laid out kind of like for the first 6 to 12 months, just because whereas kind of like Bob's networks were both local and global, my networks are mainly here in Chicago, in the Chicago area. So basically I figured start small, start with what you know, start with the relationships that you already have, back to asset-based community development. And so for better or for worse, we're starting off kind of a little bit Chicago centric, because that's just where we're located. But as Bob and I talked over the years also, we'd have this discussion too about how great CTU is on the global and how kind of like good but not great it can be sometimes on the local. So as I'm starting off too, trying to kind of like find that balance, maybe emphasizing the local Chicago, because again, this is where I physically am, the presence we walk through every day. And so that kind of being our starting point, but not our ending point, like you're pointing out. So that with somebody in rural Ohio, this may sound like a bunch of hogwash, like, well, why should I care about that? Well, eventually, hopefully we'll be able to address more than just Chicago, but we have to start somewhere. So starting like locally, starting with the networks that we know, and then God willing, as we grow, we can grow to address like more and more issues and help more people. Oh, and as far as the listening circles go, for kind of like the political divide, I think everyone in the room, probably your light bulbs went on right away, when you're realizing that folks just cannot talk to each other civilly about politics and other things. I taught high school for about 4 years. I was a college professor, then a high school teacher, and now I'm here. I've had a strange trajectory. But I was always amazed because I taught high school sophomores, and we get into these really intense discussions about politics, about race, gender, sexuality, all these things. They're able to remain civil to each other while disagreeing. And I have to tell them, wait a second, stop. They look at me like, Dr. C, why are we stopping? So I'd say, you have to realize what you're doing now as 16-year-olds, the majority of adults in this country cannot do what you're doing right now. So part of it also might be, again, I'm just kind of like brainstorming here. So this is not kind of like written in stone. How is it that if we get our young folks involved and learn from them as well? Because basically, any kind of movement for justice, for reconciliation, yes, adults, we have to be there in the room, right? But the young folks provide a lot of energy, a lot of different perspectives. And sometimes for us older folks in there, when you see a 15 or 16-year-old, like a group of them having a very civil, heated, but respectful discussion about something, that could be a way that could teach the rest of us also how to do it. That's a little bit of an aside, but again, I just wanted to make sure that I honored what you said about kind of like the listening circles for politics as well. Okay, so we're going to pivot to the room, to the physical room, unless there's one more person on Zoom. I thought we might have had 4 groups, but I'd like to pivot to the room. Anybody else on Zoom? Going once? Going twice? Two and a half. Okay, just wanted to make sure. So Zoom folks, thank you, and please hang with us. All right, so I'll ask the question that's always a dangerous question, which is asking for volunteers before I volunteer a table to start. So any tables want to volunteer to begin with offering feedback?
Will be a good example. Yeah. Hi, my name is Susanna, and Esther and Kie and Maria. So a couple things that I will share out from our group discussion that maybe haven't already been said or build upon some of the prior things. One is we actually started off with a number of positives and thumbs up. The idea of the spring symposium and how it will model inclusive views and perspectives. We also talked about the focus on praxis and finding those intersections to build upon. We talked about the intergenerational focus, and that led to maybe, we didn't know, it's more of a question possibility, is that to use Father Schreiter's way of frameworks, including like the narrative, even as you start in your first year. So you're looking back at the 1919 riots in some way and looking forward, having young folks think about coming over trauma from racial violence, so that there's a way to use that framework to kind of give some cohesion to the first work and how important narratives will be to this. A related point, I think that Esther made really important, and it builds on this listening circles, is this ability to first learn how to be silent so that you can listen to those outside of the circle of love and know from them what their strengths or needs are, and then beginning to be present and using the gifts. And that becomes a framework that you would be modeling that's going to be important in this. And we did also have the question about priorities. And so the question is what, maybe you create the rubric or guidance of what will guide those priorities, who helps guide those priorities. And perhaps you resolve some of the tension between Chicago, again, through Schreiter, and sort of what is the local theology, spirituality first that bases on your local context, and then building from there. And I think the last thing, the tension for me, having read books that you gave me, that spirituality is not a program or a strategy. So how do you make sure the Institute doesn't create a bunch of programs? How do you create the space? How does the Institute create the space for God's work to happen? And that will start by being quiet and listening, probably. So that seems like a good challenge, is how you do that. Any other?
You did a great job.
Thumbs up, thumbs up.
Yeah, Susanna, thank you so much. So, yeah, first of all, thank you for highlighting the importance of narrative, especially when we're working with some young artists with commemorating the 1919 race riots, and how it is that maybe Bob's work on narrative can give us a way to assist with those conversations. Also appreciate pointing out that the first thing that we need to be doing before any words come out of my mouth as the Institute is just sitting down, zip my lips, and just listen and be present. Whatever someone has to say, whether what they have to say is silence, because silence is a form of communication, whether it is however it is that they want to communicate, even if they don't want me to be there, that's fine as well. But how is it that I'm responding to another at the very beginning, whether it's making sure that it's welcoming in whatever way that it is. So it's not just me kind of saying, here's a solution to your problem. And they look at me like, who the hell are you? And how can you tell me that sort of thing? So I appreciate that. And so the last question is going to be an ongoing concern as far as, since we are creating programming, but since reconciliation itself is not kind of like a managed process, as Bob would say, it's trying to figure out how it is that those spaces are created where folks can engage in the process. So just off the top of my head, I know I'll be relying a lot on PBMR, and they've been kind enough to invite me to their 4-day training in healing circles this coming January. And so part of it's just going to be trying to figure out, okay, how do we create spaces where people feel accepted, comfortable, and then as Dave Kelly and other PBMR folks could teach an entire year-long course on, like the different ways that circles are meant to work, the different purposes, outcomes, all those sorts of things. So I know none of those are like completely direct, concrete answers, but I want to make sure that I honored your questions by offering responses. please.
I'll just make a perspective. You don't have to even respond to it, but because it was all thumbs up here in terms of what we're doing, all the priorities of the thing. Again, everything that everyone else has said. One of the things though that might be unique that I haven't heard yet was we talked about the importance of covenant as one of the principles, as in the fourth part being that we create a community. You know, we would all acknowledge that the church hasn't become that very effectively in terms of giving witness to the reign of God, giving witness to that. So we're not going to ask you when you're going to heal the U.S. Bishops Conference, but maybe that in some of the work, and that's why we're at a school for ministry, because we want to impact the church. Is there other ways that we can do intervention through collaboration with the Bernardine Center? Luis was talking about the Augustinians are talking about how do they create a safe place in the church and the world for people to talk. That might be a broader concern than just CTU and maybe with the Bernardine Center, with maybe the corporate board in terms of bringing the religious communities to somehow together. We all have the same focus. This is some way maybe the Bernardine Center and the Schreiter Institute can help facilitate some sort of collaborative prophetic witness towards healing within the church as it relates to our ability to dialogue about ecclesiology. That would be something just, you know, like I say, don't have to tell me how you're going to do that or why you haven't done it yet. But just something to think about.
Okay, Bill, thank you very much. So if folks couldn't hear kind of what Bill was pointing out, is surprise, surprise, the church is broken and wounded as well. So how is it then? How can that be something that, again, as like a coalition of partners, Bernardine Center, Schreiter Institute, PBSI, all the different partners, how can we assist with the church as well? So Bill, thank you. So there's 4 tables that haven't spoken. I'm not going to force anybody to speak, but I want to give you the chance to, if you think there's something that you'd like to offer.
Well, I'm obedient. This is the table otherwise known as the PBMR Annex. And being the non-PBMR person, I got to take the notes. We love the idea of having in-person gatherings, and the conversations went really well, and the emphasis and the energy regarding collaboration, not only with people outside, but also people within the whole Precious Blood family. We didn't like the term sticking point, so we changed it to here's something, a way we could be even better.
Nice.
And that is to unpack the whole link regarding reconciliation and unpack the terms, and make the understanding of reconciliation more inclusive, not only for men and women, but for how different communities define reconciliation. And we discussed, we heard the word scholarship, we like the word scholarship, and we look forward to hearing more about scholarships as plans roll out.
Vicki, thank you. So just the main thing that I heard there, so I'm taking notes also, is unpacking the language of reconciliation, what it means, then also as this crosses cultural boundaries, subcultural boundaries, how, again, what it looks like in one context will be a little bit different than how it looks in another context, both of which may not mirror exactly what it looks like in a third context. Thank you. So any other tables want to offer any thoughts? Roger, please.
I think many of the same points that have been brought up, was already been mentioned. Things that we like in terms of the creativity, working with artists, making a link between academics, community organizing, and student. That's very important that way. A voice at the table, inclusiveness. So these are all things that other people have mentioned. So these are all, I just don't want to sit quietly like we, but we affirm all of that was there. probably in terms of the questions and how to do with this networking. How do you network with people? And then the question that was already brought up by various people, the priorities. How do you set the priorities in that way? Because there's so many different things. And it really, how do you set priorities about what you do? Maybe a 3-year plan. I'm not sure if there's an advisory board. I can't remember. I should know that, but I don't remember anymore. But I think if there's a group that can sort of help with some of the priorities and stuff like that.
Roger, thank you. And to your point, so the advisory board has not yet been established. This is an ongoing project in the first few years. And so we will have an advisory board, but it's not, we do not have one just yet. But that's going to be in the process for sure. Annie, please.
Some of the themes that came out clustered around collaboration and extension or expansion. So we had 2 internal CTU people at our table and one of Bob's former students. So we brainstormed some internal collaboration ideas, first between the archives that have inherited a vast amount of material from Bob's work, and how maybe some kind of digital repository or something that could interface with the public world could help make Bob's work more widely known and help to kind of organize the vast amount of his published and unpublished materials. Then we talked just generally about, as a tribute to Bob's work, just fostering the work of applying the methods he developed to other contexts and situations as they continue to emerge, and the idea of these same needs cropping up but in different contexts and in different areas came out. And then expanding on some of the areas he focused on in terms of reconciliation, enculturation, spirituality, expanding and deepening that work in a variety of ways. And then, while none of us can be Bob Schreiter, we talked about just his sense of presence and relationship and mentoring that came up, and trying to instill some aspect of that in the center's work somehow.
Annie, thank you. So let me just say one word quickly about one thing you brought up, because it hadn't come up yet, which is the archives. So Derek's been doing this amazing work trying to organize the Schreiter archives. So all the writings published, unpublished, I mean, anything and everything that Bob left behind, he's been working hard on. And so the archives are a work in process and something that we're looking forward to having done sometime probably in the next year or so.